In 1889, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, starring the famous sharpshooter Annie Oakley, went on tour throughout Europe and stopped for a special show in Berlin. During her show, Annie always asked for a volunteer to hold a cigar in their mouth while she shot the ashes off the end. It was a joke. Nobody ever volunteered. Everyone usually laughed, and then her hapless husband would come out to hold the cigar. However, that day in Berlin, a man walked into the arena and volunteered. It was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the King of Prussia. The Kaiser was a fan of Annie's and wanted to show how brave he was. German officers tried to stop him, but he waved them off. Those who don't know, Kaiser was a volatile man whose aggressive colonizing in Africa was at least partly to blame for World War I, which many scholars believe was an entirely avoidable war that decimated Europe and kicked off the bloodiest century in history. Annie was sort of freaking out at the moment, but thought, I can't back out of this now. So she paced her usual distance, sweating profusely, regretting that she had consumed more than her usual amount of whiskey the night before. She raised her Colt, took aim, and blew the ashes off of Kaiser Wilhelm's cigar. What would the world be like today if Annie had missed and shot Kaiser Wilhelm instead? What if the wind was blowing slightly, or something distracted her right at that moment, or she'd had too much whiskey the night before? A war might have been avoided. 40 million people died in World War I, which led to World War II and the Cold War and Vietnam. Just a few degrees, and the world might be a different place. Years later, after World War I began, Annie wrote a letter to King Wilhelm and asked if she could take another shot. He didn't reply, but you gotta love her spirit. Sometimes the most important events in history turn on just a few degrees, just a few inches. The deliverance of the Hebrew people from the empire of Egypt is a story that turns on a few inches, a few extraordinary decisions made by three women, Jochebed, Miriam, and the daughter of Pharaoh, whose actions in this story changed the course of history and led to the liberation of their people from the bondage in Egypt. But for many of us, this story has been colored by films like The Ten Commandments or The Prince of Egypt, where it seems as if the hand of God is at work guiding the basket with the infant Moses past crocodiles and hippopotamuses. It's not hippopotami, it's hippopotamuses. Past fishermen, past warships, through the treacherous waters of the Nile, God's hand there the whole way. But is it helpful for us, I wonder, to view this story and other stories in the Bible and even the story of our lives as if the actions of the characters or the events that occurred were all orchestrated as a part of God's plan? Theologians have a term for this. They call it providence. It's not just the street you drive down to get here. It's a word for God's intervention in the universe and in history, particularly God's care for creation, God's care for humanity. Augustine said the universe is under the continuous control and unifying governance of God. Many scholars make a distinction between general providence, God's governance of creation and the laws of nature, and then special providence, God's intervention in human affairs. We don't often realize it, but we're doing theology every day, all the time. Whenever we say things like, thank God, for something mundane or trivial, or when we say that was God's will, or in the words of one contemporary theologian named Drake, when we say something is God's plan. In the song, that Drake won a Grammy for in 2019. Some of y'all didn't know Drake was a theologian. In the song that Drake won a Grammy for in 2019, he says all the bad things that people are wishing and wishing and wishing on him will not come true because of God's plan for his life. Growing up as an evangelical, I was repeatedly told that God is in control. God has a plan for my life. And these statements often caused me to have anxiety about whether I was actually living in God's will or following God's plan for my life. But as I grew older, life, as it has the habit of doing, quickly disabused me of this idea. This idea that God has a specific plan for my life. Seminary, marriage, infertility, adoption, divorce, and ministry have the power to disabuse you of a lot of things, especially the idea that there's some kind of plan for you. And so I eventually gave up on the idea that God is a grand micromanager, intervening in every aspect of my existence, like whether or not I got a parking space or the Panthers won a game. I think we can all agree that God has nothing to do with the Panthers winning. But when we see glacial floods in Alaska ripping houses into the river, or massive wildfires devastating the island of Maui, or wars in Ukraine and Myanmar and Ethiopia or Sudan, or deaths, we learn things that deaths by suicide were at the highest rate ever recorded last year. It's hard to believe that God is in control of the universe or regularly intervening in human affairs. It requires a great act of faith to believe that God is actively in control of anything. And there's nothing worse than going through life and experiencing loss and grief and tragedy and death, and then having somebody say one of those well-intentioned theological horrors, everything happens for a reason. Or it's God's will. Or if you just pray harder. Or God needed another angel. Or it's all part of God's plan. If anyone ever says something like this to you in a difficult time, you have my pastoral permission to tell them to get lost. Life is more complicated than that. Faith is more complicated. God is more complicated. There are mysteries beyond our comprehension, things about life and God we cannot begin to fathom. And yet a lot of people want a theology that is neat and tidy to try to protect God from all the bad things going on in our lives and in our world. But God doesn't need our protection. And the world is full of paradoxes and complexities and enigmas that cannot be easily resolved with a cookie-cutter theology. Don't tell me that things are part of God's plan that have nothing to do with God. Colonialism, genocide, slavery, imperialism, and the Holocaust were not part of God's plan. These are the consequences of human activity. Patriarchy, racism, bigotry, homophobia, xenophobia, ageism, ableism. Those are not part of God's plan. Those are human plans. The true mystery of providence is that God did not intervene to stop these horrors. When the Mauthausen concentration camp was liberated in 1945, soldiers found these words written on the walls by those who were in prison. If there is a God, then he must ask for my forgiveness. Life caused me to give up on a simple view of God's providence, and I must admit, I've been feeling pretty good about it. Feeling good about jettisoning any anxiety about God's will or plan for my life, that I've evolved past that earlier theology. I've had a lot of education, read a lot of theology. I've been preaching for 20 years, and I thought I had my theology in order and a good grip on the mystery of providence. And then I found myself sitting next to a woman at a conference, just having a pleasant conversation, when out of nowhere she said to me, "Do you believe it was God's plan for you to adopt your daughter?" Do you believe it was God's plan for you to adopt Lucy? Her question shattered me. I replied rather quickly, oh no, I don't believe in that God of simple cause and effect, not me. But it was baloney. The truth is, for years, I believed that God had ordained me to adopt Lucy, that it was part of God's divine plan for my life and for hers. I thought I'd moved on from this shallow version of providential theology, but there it was, right there. Providence was how I'd made sense of struggle and disappointment. It was how I'd found meaning through infertility and the process of adoption. It was the story that I'd created to give meaning and divine significance to how my family came to be, but it was far too simple a story. And when I began to interrogate my view of providence, the one I still had, I realized some pretty troubling things. I realized that if it was God's plan for me to adopt Lucy, then it was also God's plan for Lucy's birth mother to find herself in a situation so desperate she felt it necessary to give up a child. And I realized that if it was God's plan for me to adopt my daughter, then it was God's plan for her to experience trauma and loss. Adoption, as I have learned, is the only trauma the world expects you to be grateful for. If it was God's plan for me to adopt Lucy, then that means it was God's plan for Lucy to be raised by white parents in order to fulfill our need for a family. What kind of God does that? What kind of God forces a person into desperation so another can have a child? What kind of God puts a child through loss and trauma so that people can create a family? I had to rethink some things. I had to reinterrogate my own views. And as I was coming to grips with the fact that providence still determined the way that I thought about my most intimate relationships, about my own family, I heard a friend of mine say that one of the only examples of adoption in the Bible is Moses. And it immediately made me think about Moses' mother, Jochebed. Was it God's plan for her to give up a child? That's how I've read the story in the past for years. But I can't do that anymore. Because viewing her decision through the lens of simple providence takes out all the pain, all the loss, all the trauma. It takes out all the humanity out of it. What kind of God would put a mother in such a desperate situation or demand such a thing for the sake of liberation? It was not God's plan for Pharaoh to order a horrific genocide against the Hebrew people. It was not God's plan for Jochebed to find herself in such a dangerous time that she had to hide her newborn child and then put him in a papyrus basket and then place him in a river. When we look back on her decision through rose-colored goggles of shallow providence, knowing, because we know the end of the story, that Moses survived and she became his nurse and he would help deliver her people from slavery, we miss the power and the pain of Jochebed's decision. We imagine it was easy, a simple part of God's providence, or that Jochebed did it with some kind of incomprehensible faith that this was God's will for her life and for Moses. No, Jochebed didn't know any of that when she put him in a basket. All she knew is that her son wouldn't survive with her, so she made a decision. And it must have ripped her heart out to send Moses in that basket down the Nile with no idea what would happen to him. The poet laureate of California right now is an adopted Korean American named Lee Herrick. And I recently heard him recite a poem that he wrote about his birth mother. He said, "I've been told mothers never forget the body. I can't remember your face, the shape or story, or how you held me the day I was born, so I wrote 1,000 poems to survive. I want to sing with you in an open field, a simple room, or a quiet bar. I want to hear your opinions about angels. Truth is, angels drink too, soju spilled on the halo, white wings sticky with gin, as if any mother could forget the music that left her. You should hear how loudly I sing now. I've become a ballad of wild dreams and coping mechanisms. I can breathe now through any fire. I imagine I got this from you. My earthly inheritance, your arms, your sigh, your heavy song. I know all the lyrics. I know all the blood. I know why angels howl into the moonlight. How should we think of God's providence in light of trauma and loss, destruction, tragedy, and death? Theologian Kate Bowler, who was diagnosed at age 40 with a form of terminal cancer, writes, "Life is not fair. I can't reconcile the way the world is jolted by events that are wonderful and terrible, gorgeous and tragic, except that I'm beginning to believe these opposites do not cancel each other out. I see a middle-aged woman," she writes, "in the waiting room of the cancer clinic, her arms wrapped around the frail frame of her son. She squeezes him tightly, oblivious to the way he looks down at her sheepishly. He laughs after a minute, a hostage to her impervious love. Joy persists, somehow, and I soak it in." She writes, "The horror of my cancer has made everything seem like it is painted in bright colors. I think the same thoughts again and again. Life is so beautiful. Life is so hard. And God is here. We are loved. And that is enough. There will be no lasting proof that God exists. There will be no formula for how to live. There will be no discernible plan given to us. But love," she writes, "offered me a small bit of certainty, and I clung to it. When feelings recede like the tides, love will leave an imprint, and we will all somehow be marked by the presence of an unbidden God." Empire is not part of God's plan. Genocide is not God's plan. Slavery is not God's plan. Mothers giving up their children is not God's plan. Desperation is not God's plan. Trauma is not God's plan. Loss is not God's plan. Suffering is not God's plan. Love is God's plan. Life is God's plan. Liberation is God's plan. God's plan does not create suffering to find some way to redeem it. Instead, God draws near to the desperate with a preferential care for those suffering, the poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed. God doesn't preordain a perfect storyline for our lives. God just shows up in the middle of our desperation and helps to weave a new story. God didn't plan for me to adopt Lucy, but when all of us who were involved made the decision, God showed up in it and responded to it. God didn't plan for Pharaoh's genocide, but responded with liberation. God didn't plan for Jochebed to put her child in the river, but God responded by drawing him out. As it says in Genesis 50, what the world plans for evil, God turns for good. God did not plan for the crucifixion, but God responded with resurrection. God does not plan for oppression, but God responds with liberation. While the empire was busy using the river to kill and destroy, God showed up and used that same river to save and to liberate. Wherever there is evil in the world, God is at work weaving another story. God does not promise to create a specific customized plan for our lives that will work out the way that we hope and dream, but God promises to show up and to show out, to take up residence in our neighborhood, to put on flesh, to be with us as Emmanuel, and to abide with us even unto the end of the age through everything that we experience. And while it may look like the empire is winning, and death and oppression is all there is, God is busy doing a new thing through the lives of the poor and through women like Jochebed, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter. What the world intends for evil, God turns to good. When a wrong needs righting, or a truth needs preaching, or a work needs doing, God shows up in history and finds often women, woman and a child. Long ago, when a child was laid in a basket, and then a child was laid in a manger, God showed up and found a way to inspire those children to become vessels of liberation for the world. So we don't need to spend our lives trying to understand the mystery of God's ways or find a customized plan for our life. All we have to do is learn how to find a way to participate in the new thing God is already doing. Today, 73% of Americans say that they believe that God has a plan for their lives. But what many Americans don't realize is that God is not going to send us a customized and unique plan for each one of us, determining every one of our days, including our parking spaces. And that's because God's plan for us is already there. It's the same as it was yesterday, today, and forever. God's plan is always the same. It's always to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. God's plan is always to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to declare the year of Jubilee. God's plan is always for us to give people their daily bread and wages, forgiveness of sins and forgiveness of financial debts, to bring the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. God's plan is always for us to feed the hungry and quench the thirsty and welcome the stranger and clothe the naked and care for the sick and visit those in prison. God's plan is always for us to love every day with all of our heart, mind, soul, and body, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. That's God's plan for every single one of us. God's plan for our lives is always the same. And there are an infinite number of ways that each of us can fulfill God's plan for our lives. There's no one plan, one will, one purpose, one providential decree. Things are not predetermined. There is simply life. Life. Messy, unpredictable, complicated, and mysterious. Filled with pain and suffering, oppression, and often desperation. God does not ordain the pain and the suffering, but promises to show up in the midst of it and to help us to write a different story. Life is not about providence or plans, figuring out God's will for our lives. It's about finding God in the midst of our lives, in the midst of our suffering, and leaning on God's strength to act, to make decisions, to take responsibility. God does not create evil, injustice, death, and destruction. God responds to it. Over and over again, God responds. God shows up in our lives with the strength for the journey, courage, conviction, and community for the struggle. The world can turn on just a few inches, just a few actions, just a few small decisions, which means that every one of us has the power not only to change the course of our lives, but to change the course of history. Life, love, and liberation. That's God's plan. And the good news is that God can find us in the midst of our desperation and draw us out of the water and write a new story, because God always has the power to take what the world meant for evil and turn it for good. Amen.